The barn was already dying when Caleb Wright first saw it. Rotted beams splitting under their own weight, foundation crumbling into the mountain soil, roof sagging like broken ribs. He'd driven 3 hours into these peaks to say no to another desperate client, another impossible deadline, another project that would demand more than he could afford to give. But when Elena Moore met him at the property line with dirt on her hands and exhaustion in her eyes, she didn't beg. She didn't plead. She asked one question that stopped him cold. "Are you married, Mr. Wright?" His answer, honest, unguarded, immediate, cracked something open in both of them that neither had planned for. What should have been a simple consultation became the question that changed everything. If you want to see how a single father's carefully controlled life collides with a woman fighting to save her legacy, stay with me until the end. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The truck's suspension groaned as Caleb guided it up the narrow mountain road, gravel crunching under tires that had seen better days. His daughter Mia sat in the passenger seat, headphones on, lost in whatever music kept her company during these weekend drives. She was 12 now, old enough to recognize when her father was running toward work and away from everything else. He didn't blame her for the silence. He'd earned it. The address led them higher than he'd expected, past the last gas station, beyond the cell signal, into terrain where the pines grew thick and the air carried the smell of elevation and old wood. When the GPS finally quit, Caleb relied on the hand-drawn map the client had emailed. A woman named Elena Moore, who'd called his office 4 times before he'd answered, 5 times before he'd agreed to drive out for a consultation. "Just a look," he'd told her. "No promises." "That's all I'm asking," she'd replied. He should have known better. The property appeared around a bend like something from a folk song, a clearing carved from wilderness, a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimstone chimney, and behind it, the barn. Even from a distance, Caleb could see it was in trouble. The roofline sagged in the middle, the siding had gone gray with age and neglect, and one corner of the structure leaned at an angle that made his chest tight. He parked near the cabin. Mia pulled off her headphones. "You're going to say no," she said. "Not a question." "Probably." "You always do." Caleb cut the engine. "That's because most people want miracles on impossible timelines. I build things that last. That takes time." Mia gave him a look, the one that said she'd heard this speech before, the one that reminded him she was smart enough to see through his justifications. "Maybe someone actually needs help, Dad." Before he could answer, the cabin door opened. Elena Moore stepped onto the porch wearing canvas work pants, a faded flannel shirt, and boots that had seen serious use. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her hands, calloused, dirt-stained, told Caleb she wasn't some weekender playing at rural life. She was maybe 40, with the kind of face that had seen weather and worry, but hadn't surrendered to either. She approached the truck with the stride of someone who'd grown up walking uneven ground. Caleb climbed out, extending his hand. "Ms. Moore." Caleb Wright. Her grip was firm, brief. "Elena, thank you for coming all this way. This is my daughter, Mia." Elena nodded toward the girl. "Nice to meet you." Mia offered a small wave, then retreated back to her phone, giving them space. Elena gestured toward the barn. "I won't waste your time with small talk. You can see what I'm dealing with." Caleb walked toward the structure, his trained eye already cataloging failures. The foundation stones had shifted, creating gaps where weather had gotten in. The siding boards were splitting along the grain. The roof, what he could see of it, had patches of missing shingles and probable water damage beneath. "How old?" he asked. "Built in 1947 by my grandfather. My father maintained it until he died 8 months ago." Caleb stopped at the entrance. The barn doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the smell hit him, damp wood, rot, the particular decay that came from years of deferred maintenance. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating motes of dust and the skeletal framework of what had once been solid construction. "Your father," Caleb said carefully. "He let it go?" Elena's jaw tightened. "He got sick, cancer. By the time we knew it was serious, he didn't have the strength for this kind of work. I was in Seattle visiting on weekends when I could. I should have—" She stopped herself. "It doesn't matter now. What matters is whether it can be saved." Caleb moved deeper into the barn, testing floorboards with his weight, examining joints, running his hands along beams. The craftsmanship underneath the damage was extraordinary. Hand-hewn timber, mortise, and tenon joints. The kind of work that didn't exist anymore because nobody had the patience or skill. Someone had built this to outlast themselves. "The bones are good," he said, "but the rot's extensive. Foundation needs rebuilding. Roof needs complete replacement. Siding's got to come off so we can assess the frame properly. This isn't a repair job. It's a restoration." "Can you do it?" Caleb turned to face her. "I can, but you're looking at 12 to 16 weeks minimum, and that's with a full crew and ideal weather. The cost—" "30 days," Elena interrupted. Caleb blinked. "Excuse me?" "I have 30 days." He waited for her to smile, to acknowledge the absurdity. She didn't. "Ms. Moore." "Elena." "Elena, what you're asking for isn't physically possible. Even if I dropped every other job, brought in extra workers, worked around the clock, 30 days to restore a structure this size, this damaged, you'd get rushed work. Shortcuts. It wouldn't last 5 years. I know what I'm asking." Her voice stayed level, but something shifted in her expression, something desperate trying hard not to show. "My father took out a loan against this property 15 years ago to pay for my mother's medical bills. He'd been making payments ever since, but after he died, the bank accelerated the terms. I have 30 days to bring the barn up to code and pass a county inspection, or they foreclose on the entire property." Caleb felt the familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, the weight of someone else's crisis, someone else's impossible situation, someone else's need for saving. He'd stopped carrying that weight 3 years ago. He'd had to. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really am. But what you need is a contractor willing to slap some patches on and pray the inspector doesn't look too close. That's not what I do." Elena nodded slowly. "I called 18 contractors before I found your number. 15 didn't call back. 2 came out, looked around, and left. One said he could do it for $40,000. That's probably fair for rushed work. I have $12,000 in savings. That's it." The number landed between them like a stone into still water. Caleb's hands found his pockets. "Then I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry about your father. I'm sorry about the barn. But I can't manufacture time or money that doesn't exist." He started toward the entrance, the conversation clearly over in his mind. Behind him, Elena's voice came quiet, almost conversational. "Are you married, Mr. Wright?" Caleb stopped, turned. "What? Are you married?" The question felt like a reach into territory that had nothing to do with barns or timelines. "No. Why?" Elena's eyes held steady on his. "Because I was. For 11 years. He was a good man. Taught high school, coached soccer, made our daughter laugh at terrible jokes. Then one Tuesday morning, he went for a run and collapsed on the trail. Heart defect nobody knew about. He was 38. Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. "After he died," Elena continued, "everyone told me I was strong, resilient, that I'd get through it, and I did, mostly because I didn't have a choice. But the truth is, I got through it by making myself smaller, safer. I moved back here to take care of my father, kept my head down, didn't ask for anything from anyone." She took a step toward him. "Then my father died too, and I realized I'd spent years protecting myself from more loss by refusing to build anything new. No risks, no exposure, just maintenance and survival." "I'm sorry for your losses," Caleb said, "but I still can't—" "I'm not asking you to save me," Elena cut in. "I'm asking if you understand what it's like to build walls so high that nothing can get in. Not help, not connection, not the possibility that someone might show up and actually give a damn." The words hit harder than they should have. Caleb glanced back toward his truck, where Mia sat scrolling through her phone, separated from him by glass and distance in 3 years of his carefully managed emotional absence. "I know what I'm asking is unreasonable," Elena said. "I know 30 days isn't enough time to do this right, but this barn is the last thing my father built his life around. If I lose it, I lose the land. I lose the only place that still feels like it holds my family, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I was too afraid to ask for help until it was too late." Caleb looked at the barn again, really looked. Beneath the rot and ruin, he could see what it had been, what it could be. The kind of work that mattered, the kind that lasted, the kind he'd stopped taking on because it required caring about more than just the construction. I can't promise it'll pass inspection, he heard himself say. Not in 30 days. Elena's expression didn't change, but her shoulders dropped an inch. Relief or resignation, he couldn't tell which. But, Caleb continued, I can promise that every hour I put into this will be honest work. No shortcuts, no patches that'll fail in a year. If it comes down to choosing between finishing fast and building right, I'll choose right every time, even if that means we don't make the deadline. I wouldn't want it any other way. Then we need to talk terms. I'll do the skilled work myself, framing, joinery, anything structural. You'll need to help with demolition, material runs, whatever doesn't require a license. I'll bring in one assistant for roofing. Everything else we do ourselves. What about payment? Caleb ran the math in his head. Materials alone would eat most of her savings. His time, his assistant's wages, equipment rental, the numbers didn't work. They couldn't work. Half up front for materials, he said. We'll figure out the rest when we see what we're dealing with. Elena's eyes narrowed. That's not a real number? No, Caleb admitted. It's not. But I stopped doing real numbers 3 years ago when my wife decided our marriage was getting in the way of her career. She moved to Portland, I got primary custody of Mia, and I learned that some things cost more than money. The confession surprised him. He didn't talk about Sarah, didn't explain, didn't open doors to questions about failure and abandonment and the particular loneliness of single parenthood. Elena seemed to understand that. What do you need from me? Honesty. If something's not working, you tell me. If you can't keep up, you tell me. This timeline's going to be brutal, and I can't waste time managing expectations or egos. Deal. And I need coffee. Good coffee. The barn work starts at sunrise, and I don't function without caffeine. A small smile touched Elena's mouth, the first he'd seen. I can manage that. They shook hands again, and this time the grip lasted a beat longer. A commitment made. A risk accepted. Caleb walked back to his truck where Mia was watching through the window with open curiosity. He opened the door. Change of plans. We're going to be spending weekends up here for a while. Mia's eyebrows went up. You said yes? I said yes. Why? Caleb looked back at Elena, who'd started walking the perimeter of the barn, already cataloging work in her mind. Because somebody asked. 3 days later. The demolition began on a Saturday morning that promised rain. Caleb arrived at dawn with his truck loaded, tools, safety equipment, tarps, the industrial waste bins they'd need for debris. Mia came too, equipped with work gloves and the sullen determination of a 12-year-old who'd been told this was character building. Elena met them at the barn with coffee that lived up to its promise and a thermos of something she called breakfast soup. My grandmother's recipe, she explained. You'll need calories. The soup was thick, savory, everything a body needed before hard labor. Caleb drank it standing up, watching the sky. Rain's coming, he said. The tarp's ready. Elena gestured to the massive blue sheeting folded near the barn's entrance. We get the roof exposed, we cover it immediately. You've done this before. I grew up here. My father rebuilt the chicken coop 3 times before I turned 15. I know how weather works in these mountains. They started with the siding, prying away boards that had gone soft with rot. Underneath, the frame revealed itself. Some timbers still solid, others compromised. Caleb marked everything with chalk, red for replacement, yellow for assessment, green for sound. By noon, they'd removed the entire south wall. The barn stood exposed like a skeleton, its structure visible for the first time in decades. Mia worked alongside them, hauling debris to the bins, asking questions about why certain joints had failed, why others held. Caleb answered when he could, surprised by her interest, grateful for the distraction from his own thoughts. This beam, Mia said, running her hand along a massive hand-hewn timber. Why is it different from the others? Elena stepped closer. That's old-growth Douglas fir. You don't find timber like that anymore. Trees that grew for 300 years before they were cut. The grain's so tight, the wood's almost indestructible. Well, why'd they stop using it? Because we cut them all down, Caleb said. Now we use faster growing trees, plantation timber. It's good enough for most things, but it's not this. Mia traced the adze marks in the wood, the evidence of human hands shaping something meant to outlast them. Will you teach me how to do this? Build things that last? The question caught Caleb unprepared. He'd been teaching Mia carpentry basics since she was 8. How to measure, how to drive a nail straight, how to read grain. But he'd always framed it as practical knowledge, not legacy. Yeah, he said, if you want to learn. I want to. Elena watched them both, something unreadable in her expression. The rain started just after 2, not a downpour, but steady, cold, the kind that would soak through to skin. They scrambled to secure the tarp over the exposed roof, fighting wind that tried to tear it from their hands. Northwest corner, Caleb shouted. Elena was already there, clipping the tarp to temporary anchors they'd set. Water ran down her face, plastered her hair to her skull, but her hand stayed steady. They got it secured with minutes to spare. Underneath the tarp, the 3 of them stood breathing hard, soaked, victorious in the small way that comes from beating weather. First day down, Elena said. 27 to go. Caleb looked at what they'd accomplished. 1 wall removed, the skeleton exposed. The scope of work now brutally clear. In 30 days, they'd have to rebuild everything they'd just torn apart, plus address the foundation, the roof, the interior structure. It was impossible. They all knew it. We'll need help, he said. For the roof, I know a guy. How much? He owes me a favor. I'll call it in. Elena nodded. Then we keep moving. Week 1. The days fell into a rhythm brutal in its simplicity. Sunrise arrival, coffee, work until dark, drive home, collapse, repeat. Caleb brought Mia every weekend, and Elena's daughter, Sophie, 19, home from community college, joined them when her class schedule allowed. The 4 of them became a crew bound by shared exhaustion and the particular intimacy that comes from physical work. They learned each other's strengths, Elena's precision with measurements, Mia's surprising comfort with power tools, Sophie's ability to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked. Caleb worked with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, his hands moving with the confidence of 30 years' experience. He'd started carpentry at 15, learned from his grandfather who'd learned from his grandfather, a lineage of men who'd believed that how you built things said everything about who you were. You don't rush quality, his grandfather used to say. You rush, you get collapse. The foundation came first. They excavated around the existing stone base, discovering that the original builders had gone deep, below the frost line, anchored to bedrock. The stones themselves were sound, but the mortar had failed. Caleb mixed new mortar to period-appropriate specifications, taught Mia how to butter each stone, how to check for level, how to build something that would settle and hold. Why do we care about matching the old mortar? Mia asked. Because when the inspector comes, he's going to look for shortcuts. Modern quick-set mortar cures faster, but it's harder than the stone. When things shift, and they always shift, the stone cracks instead of the mortar. Original lime mortar flexes, lasts longer. So we're doing more work to make it look old? We're doing more work to make it right. Elena listened to these exchanges, occasionally adding details about how her grandfather had sourced these particular stones from a quarry 20 miles north, how he'd numbered each one to remember its placement. The barn wasn't just a structure to her. It was a document of her family's labor, their choices, their refusal to accept easy solutions. By the end of week 1, they'd reset the entire foundation. It was invisible work, nothing dramatic, nothing the casual observer would notice, but Caleb felt the satisfaction that came from knowing it would hold for another 70 years. That Friday evening, as they packed tools into twilight, Elena appeared with a cooler. Beer? She offered. Caleb hesitated. He'd made it a policy not to socialize with clients, to keep the boundaries clear and professional. But looking at Elena, dirt-streaked, exhausted, holding out a cold beer with hands that had matched his work hour for hour, the policy seemed absurd. Yeah, he said, thanks. They sat on the foundation they'd just rebuilt, watching the sky turn colors that mountains specialized in. Mia and Sophie had wandered off to explore the woods, their voices carrying back in fragments of teenage conversation. "You're quieter than I expected," Elena said. "Am I? Most contractors I've met like to talk, explain things, make sure you know they're the expert." Caleb smiled slightly. "I figured the work would speak for itself." "It does." Elena took a long drink. "Your daughter's good at this." "She's good at most things when she decides to care, which isn't often lately. 12's a hard age. 12 with a mother who decided parenting was optional is harder." The bitterness in his voice surprised him. He didn't talk about Sarah, didn't give air to the anger that lived just under his professional exterior. Elena didn't probe, didn't offer platitudes. She just sat with the statement, "Let it exist." After a while, she said, "Sophie was 9 when my husband died. For a year, she didn't talk about him. Not once. Then one day she asked if I thought he'd be proud of who she was becoming. I said yes, because that's what you say. But the truth is, I don't know. He didn't get enough time with her to know who she'd become." "I'm sorry. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because I recognize what you're doing. The walls, the distance, the belief that if you just work hard enough, keep moving fast enough, you won't have to feel how much it hurts that someone left." Caleb felt the words land in his chest, settle into the space he'd been defending for 3 years. "Does it work?" he asked quietly. "No," Elena said, "but we keep trying anyway." They sat in silence after that, watching the mountains go dark, understanding something about each other that didn't require further explanation. Pause. Week 2. The frame. The lumber arrived on Monday morning, 2 full trucks of Douglas fir, graded and certified, far more expensive than the budget allowed. Caleb had argued with the supplier for an hour, finally calling in every favor he had to get a price that wouldn't destroy Elena's savings. "This is too much," Elena said, reviewing the delivery manifest. "It's what we need. The old frame's 60% compromised. We replace it right, or we don't replace it at all." They spent 2 days just cutting, measuring each beam to exact specifications, accounting for settling, planning for the decades of movement that would come. Caleb worked with the intensity of someone who understood that precision now meant integrity later. Sophie showed up Tuesday afternoon with lunch and questions. She was studying environmental science, and the barn restoration had become a case study in sustainable construction, adaptive reuse, the difference between preservation and renovation. "Why not just tear it down and build new?" she asked Caleb. "Because new would be 2x6s and engineered lumber. Strong enough, but generic. This barn has character, the marks of the tools that shaped it, the evidence of the hands that built it. You can't replicate that. You can only honor it." "Is that why it matters so much to my mom?" Caleb looked to where Elena was working with Mia, showing her how to mark mortise joints. "Your mom's fighting to keep something that holds your family's story. That's worth more than efficiency." Sophie nodded slowly. "She doesn't talk about my dad much anymore. I think she's afraid if she starts, she won't be able to stop. Maybe that's not the worst thing." "Maybe." The frame went up over 5 days of relentless work. Caleb had called in his assistant, Marcus, a former student who'd become one of the finest Finnish carpenters Caleb knew. Together, they raised beams that weighed 300 pounds, secured joints that would hold the structure together for the next century, built a skeleton that would bear weight and weather and time. Elena proved herself capable of work that surprised even Caleb. She could handle a nail gun with precision, read plans without guidance, anticipate engineering problems before they became critical. More than once, Caleb found himself deferring to her judgment on details about the original construction. "Your father taught you well," he said, after she'd corrected his approach to a particularly complex corner joint. "He taught me that buildings are conversations with the future. What we do here, someone will see in 50 years and make decisions based on whether we cared enough to do it right." By Friday of week 2, the frame stood complete, straight, true, squared to tolerances that exceeded code requirements. They'd lost days to weather, made up time through longer hours, survived on coffee and determination, and the particular stubbornness that comes from refusing to accept failure. That evening, standing inside the skeleton of the barn, with sunset streaming through the gaps where walls would eventually go, Caleb felt something shift. This wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't even just about saving Elena's land. It was about proving that quality still mattered, that craftsmanship wasn't obsolete, that choosing the hard right over the easy wrong was still possible in a world that had forgotten the difference. "We're going to make it," Elena said beside him. Caleb wanted to believe her, but they were 14 days in with 16 days left, and they hadn't even started the roof. "Maybe," he said. Elena's hand found his shoulder, brief contact there and gone, but enough to communicate something that didn't fit into words. Trust, partnership. The acknowledgement that they were in this together now, whatever came. Across the barn, Mia and Sophie were laughing about something, their voices echoing in the empty space that would soon be filled with walls and purpose. Caleb listened to his daughter's laughter, a sound he'd heard too rarely in the past 3 years, and made a decision. They'd make the deadline. Somehow. Not because it was reasonable or possible, but because Elena had asked one question that mattered. "Are you married?" The answer had been no. But the real question underneath, "Are you willing to let someone in?" that answer was changing. He just hoped he hadn't figured it out too late. The roof was where everything would either come together or fall apart, and Caleb knew it the moment he climbed the ladder Monday morning of week 3. Marcus had arrived before dawn with his truck loaded with safety harnesses, roofing jacks, and enough cedar shingles to cover twice the surface area they needed. "Always order extra," Marcus said, stacking bundles near the barn's base. "Murphy's Law applies double when you're working against a deadline." Elena appeared with coffee just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, her hair still wet from a shower, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of nights spent reviewing county inspection codes and bank foreclosure procedures. "The inspector called yesterday," she said without preamble. "He's scheduled for 3 weeks from today, 11 o'clock. Caleb did the math, 21 days. They had the frame up, the foundation secure, but still needed roofing, siding, interior bracing, electrical updates to meet code, and a dozen other details that would determine whether the barn passed or failed. Did he say what he'd be looking for specifically? Structural integrity, water resistance, load-bearing capacity. He mentioned that old barns often fail on lateral bracing, says the wind up here can generate forces that exceed original construction standards. Caleb nodded slowly. The inspector wasn't wrong. Mountain wind could tear a roof off if the connections weren't engineered properly. Original 1947 construction had relied on mass and joinery, but modern code required hurricane ties, structural screws, reinforcement that the barn's builders had never imagined. "We'll need to add bracing without compromising the original frame," he said. "It's possible, but it'll add days." "How many days?" 3. Maybe 4. Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "Then we work faster everywhere else." Marcus had been listening while assembling his safety gear. He was 28, built like someone who'd spent his life doing physical labor, with the quiet confidence that came from mastery. Caleb had taught him everything from basic framing to advanced timber joinery, and Marcus had absorbed it all with the focus of someone who understood that craft mattered. "I can pull double shifts this week," Marcus offered. "My other jobs just finish work on a kitchen remodel. I can push it back." "I can't pay you double." "Didn't ask you to. This barn's the kind of project I got into this work for. Modern construction's all speed and cost-cutting. Nobody builds like this anymore." Caleb felt gratitude settle into his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. For 3 years, he'd operated on the principle that relying on others meant exposing yourself to disappointment. But standing here with Marcus volunteering time and Elena trusting him with her family's legacy, that principle felt less like wisdom and more like fear. "All right," Caleb said. "Let's get started." They began by stripping the remaining original roof, shingles that had been hand-split from cedar logs, now curled and split and failing after 7 decades of weather. Underneath, the roof decking told its own story. Some boards solid, others rotted through, all of it needing replacement. Mia showed up around 9 with Sophie, both of them dressed for work. School was out for spring break, which meant Mia had announced she'd be spending the entire week at the mountain, helping with the barn. Caleb had argued briefly before realizing his daughter was offering him something he'd stopped expecting, her presence, her effort, her choice to be part of something difficult. "Put us to work," Mia said. Elena handed them both tool belts. "Ground crew, We're going to be pulling old decking and dropping it down. You two sort it. Anything salvageable goes in one pile for reuse. Total loss goes to the debris bin. For the next 6 hours, they worked in a rhythm that felt almost choreographed. Caleb and Marcus on the roof, pulling boards, calling out warnings. Elena on a ladder halfway up, passing down materials, maintaining the flow. Mia and Sophie on the ground, sorting, stacking, hauling. The work was hard enough that conversation became minimal, just the necessary communication of people coordinating complex tasks. But in the silence, Caleb found himself hyper-aware of Elena's presence, the way she moved with economy and purpose, the particular set of her shoulders when she was solving a problem in her head. Around 2 in the afternoon, they broke for lunch. Elena had brought sandwiches thick with roast beef and vegetables from her garden, along with a salad that tasted like it had been picked that morning. They ate sitting on the newly rebuilt foundation, boots dangling, sun warming their backs. Sophie was telling Mia about her environmental science class, something about watershed management and erosion control that Caleb only half followed. "Your mom grows all this?" Mia asked, gesturing to the vegetables. "Everything except the meat," Sophie said. "She's got a whole setup, greenhouse, raised beds, composting system. Says it's cheaper than grocery stores and tastes better anyway." Mia turned to Elena. "Could you teach me? We've got a yard, but Dad just mows it." Elena smiled. "Sure. Gardening's like carpentry. You get out what you put in, and shortcuts always cost you later." "Everything's like that according to Dad," Mia said, but there was affection in her voice, not complaint. Caleb caught Elena's eye, saw understanding there. She knew what it meant that Mia was engaging, asking to learn, choosing to spend her break doing manual labor instead of whatever 12-year-olds did with free time. "Greenhouse tour after we finish today?" Elena offered. "Deal." Marcus was reviewing the afternoon's work plan, making notes on a piece of scrap lumber. "We pull the rest of the decking today, start new installation tomorrow. If weather holds, we can have the whole roof deck replaced by Wednesday. Then we tarp it, start on shingles Thursday." "That's optimistic," Caleb said. "That's necessary. We're burning days we don't have." He wasn't wrong. They'd already lost 2 days to rain, another half day when a delivery of structural screws came in the wrong size and had to be returned. Every delay compressed the remaining timeline, left less margin for the inevitable problems that came with restoration work. They finished lunch and got back to it. By sunset, they'd removed all the old decking and begun installing new, 3/4-inch plywood, rated for structural applications, screwed down at intervals that exceeded code requirements. Caleb didn't believe in doing the minimum. If the inspector wanted integrity, they'd give him engineering that could survive anything the mountain threw at it. That evening, as they were securing tarps against the forecast rain, Elena's phone rang. She stepped away to take it, and Caleb watched her posture change, shoulders rising, face going still in the way that meant bad news. When she returned, her expression confirmed it. "That was the bank," she said. "They're sending someone Thursday to assess the property's current condition. Says it's standard procedure for loans in default status." "Middle of our roofing work," Marcus observed. "That's not coincidental," Caleb said. "They want to see it incomplete. Gives them ammunition to argue the deadline won't be met." Elena's hands curled into fists. "My father paid on that loan for 15 years. Never missed a payment until he got too sick to work. And now they're treating this like I'm trying to scam them." "Banks don't care about history," Caleb said quietly. "They care about numbers. And right now, the numbers say foreclosure is more profitable than renegotiation." "So what do we do?" Caleb thought about the half-finished roof, the exposed structure, the dozens of ways the property could photograph poorly for an assessment report. Then he thought about his grandfather's approach to inspectors and bureaucrats. Give them nothing to complain about and everything to admire. "We make Thursday look better than it is," he said. "Clean up the site, organize materials, show active progress. And we have documentation ready, photos of the foundation work, receipts for materials, timeline projections. We make it clear this isn't amateur hour." Elena nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I can do that. I've been photographing everything anyway, for insurance purposes." "Good. Show them a project that's ahead of schedule, even if we're barely keeping pace." "Is that dishonest?" Caleb smiled slightly. "It's strategic presentation. They're doing the same thing with their assessment, making you look like a risk when you're actually a woman trying to save her family's land from a predatory lending situation. Predatory is right, Sophie said. She'd been quiet during the exchange, but now her voice carried an edge that surprised Caleb. I looked up the loan terms after Grandpa died. The interest rate jumped 3 points when he got sick. They called it a risk adjustment. Can they do that? Mia asked. If it's in the contract, yeah, Caleb said. Doesn't make it right, just legal. Elena's expression had gone from worried to determined, the shift visible in the set of her jaw. Then we give them a show, professional, organized, ahead of schedule, whatever it takes. They worked until full dark that night, cleaning the site with a thoroughness that went beyond safety requirements. Every scrap of wood got sorted or binned, tools went into organized storage, materials got stacked with military precision. By the time they finished, the property looked less like an active construction zone and more like a well-managed restoration project. Caleb was loading tools into his truck when Elena approached, 2 glasses of something amber in her hands. Whiskey, she said. My father's bottle. Seemed like the right night for it. They sat on the tailgate, watching stars emerge over the ridge. The whiskey was smooth, warm going down, tasting of smoke and age. You didn't have to do all this, Elena said after a while. The extra hours, the material upgrades, pushing your other work aside. You could have said no and been completely justified. Caleb considered that. He could have said no. Should have, by every rational measure. But sitting here with whiskey and starlight and the shape of Elena beside him, rational didn't seem like the metric that mattered. 3 years ago, he said, my wife told me I cared more about wood than people. She wasn't entirely wrong. I was working 80-hour weeks, chasing the next project, building a reputation on quality that came at the cost of being present. When she left, I told myself it was her fault for not understanding what mattered. But, Elena prompted gently, but she was right. I'd made carpentry into an excuse to avoid intimacy, easier to pour everything into work than to risk being vulnerable with another person. Elena took a slow sip. And now? Now I'm realizing that building things doesn't have to mean hiding from people, that maybe the best work happens when you care about more than just the structure. They sat with that for a moment, the words hanging in the mountain air between them. I asked if you were married, Elena said, because I needed to know if you understood what it felt like to have someone leave, to build your life around another person and then suddenly have to rebuild it alone. I understand that. I know you do. I could see it in the way you looked at your daughter, like you were grateful she was there but terrified she'd leave too. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Caleb had spent 3 years managing his relationship with Mia through careful distance, afraid that if he needed her too much, she'd see him as weak, as the kind of father who couldn't handle things alone. Is it that obvious? He asked. Only to someone doing the same thing. Sophie and I have been circling each other for 2 years, both pretending we're fine, both terrified that if we admit we're not, everything will fall apart. Has it worked? Elena laughed softly. Not even a little. But we keep trying. Caleb drained his whiskey, feeling the warmth settle into his bones. For what it's worth, I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for. Sophie's confident, capable, clearly cares about you. That doesn't happen by accident. She's a good kid. Better than I probably deserve. I doubt that's true. Elena turned to look at him, and in the darkness, Caleb could barely make out her features. Just the suggestion of eyes, the curve of her cheek, the way her hair had come loose from its braid. Thank you, she said, for all of this. For saying yes when you should have said no. Thank you for asking the one question that mattered. The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibility and proximity, and the particular tension that comes from 2 people recognizing something they're not quite ready to name. Then Elena stood, breaking the spell. Early start tomorrow, she said. Roof deck won't install itself. No, Caleb agreed. It won't. He drove home that night with Mia asleep in the passenger seat, her head against the window, tool belt still around her waist. The work was exhausting her, but she hadn't complained once, hadn't asked to stay home, hadn't retreated into her phone and her music and the emotional distance she usually maintained. She was showing up, fully. And Caleb realized with a jolt of fear and gratitude that he needed to do the same. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of physical labor and mounting pressure. The roof deck went in faster than expected, Marcus and Caleb working with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd done this dance 100 times. Elena proved capable with a nail gun, her accuracy and speed improving hour by hour until she was keeping pace with them. Wednesday afternoon, they finished the deck. Thursday morning, the day of the bank's assessment, they started on shingles. The assessor arrived at 10, a man in his 40s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the bank's logo, carrying a clipboard and the particular expression of someone who'd already decided what he was going to write. His name was David Brennan, and he walked the property with the thoroughness of someone documenting evidence. He photographed the barn from every angle, took notes on the exposed structure, measured the stacks of materials. Elena followed him, answering questions with professional calm. Caleb stayed on the roof, working steadily, making it clear that construction was active and ongoing. "The timeline seems aggressive," Brennan said, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "County inspection in 17 days, and you're still working on the roof." "The timeline is exactly on schedule," Elena replied. "We've completed foundation work, structural framing, and roof decking ahead of projections. Roofing will be done by Monday, siding starts Tuesday. We'll be ready for inspection with days to spare." "And if you're not?" "Then I lose the property. But that's not going to happen." Brennan made a note. "The bank has concerns about the viability of this project. The loan was extended based on the property's land value, not the barn's restoration potential. From a risk management perspective," Elena interrupted, her voice hardening, "my father paid you on time for 15 years. The only risk here is that you're using a technicality to foreclose on land you can flip for 3 times what's owed." Brennan's expression didn't change. "I'll submit my report to the loan committee. They'll make the final determination." He finished his assessment, took a few more photographs, and left. Elena stood watching his car disappear down the mountain road, her whole body vibrating with suppressed fury. Caleb climbed down from the roof. "You handled that well." "I wanted to throw him off the property." "I know. You didn't. That matters." Elena turned to him, and he saw tears she was fighting to hold back. "What if we do everything right and it's still not enough? What if they foreclose anyway just because they can? Then we fight. We document everything. We get a lawyer. We make enough noise that their risk management people realize this is more trouble than it's worth." "I don't have money for lawyers." "You have photos, receipts, a timeline showing good faith effort. You have a contractor willing to testify that the work is code compliant and ahead of schedule. That's leverage." Elena nodded, pulling herself together with visible effort. Okay, we keep working." They kept working. The roofing continued through Thursday, Friday, Saturday, each day a battle against weather that turned unpredictable, sun giving way to sudden rain, wind gusting hard enough to make working at height dangerous. Sunday morning, Caleb arrived to find Elena already on the roof, alone, installing shingles with determined precision. "You're going to fall," he called up. "I'm harnessed, and we're behind schedule." He climbed up beside her. "We're not behind. We're exactly where we need to be. We've got shingles on barely half the roof, and inspection is in 13 days. "Elena." He waited until she looked at him. "We're going to make it, but not if you kill yourself trying to do everything alone." Something in her expression cracked. "I'm so tired of being alone, of carrying this by myself, of pretending I'm strong enough to handle it." "You don't have to be strong enough. That's what the rest of us are here for." She set down her nail gun, pulled off her gloves, and for a moment just breathed. Around them, the mountains stretched in every direction, indifferent and eternal. "My husband used to say that mountains don't care about your problems," Elena said quietly. "That they'll outlast whatever you're worried about, so you might as well find peace with the impermanence of everything." "Sounds Buddhist." He was. Sort of. He liked the philosophy more than the practice. She smiled slightly. "But he was right. This barn's been here 70 years. It'll be here after I'm gone, after Sophie's gone. What we're really fighting for isn't the structure. It's the right to decide what happens to it." Caleb understood that. The barn had become a symbol of autonomy, of refusing to let systems and institutions dictate what mattered. Then let's make sure you get that right, he said. They worked together the rest of that day, side by side, voices low in conversation that ranged from technical details to personal history to the particular exhaustion that comes from caring deeply about something difficult. Caleb learned that Elena had been a teacher before moving home to care for her father. High school English, passionate about getting kids to see literature as something alive and relevant. She'd loved the work, but walked away without hesitation when her father's diagnosis came. "Do you miss it?" Caleb asked. "Every day, but not enough to regret the choice. He needed me more than those kids did. And now? Now I need to figure out who I am when I'm not someone's daughter or wife or caretaker. That's terrifying." Caleb knew that territory. He'd spent 3 years being Mia's father and nothing else, letting that identity consume everything else he might have been. "Maybe we figure it out together," he said. Elena's hand stilled on the shingle she was positioning. "Are you asking me something, Caleb?" He met her eyes. "I'm saying that working on this barn has reminded me what it feels like to care about something, someone, beyond just the task. And I'd like to keep figuring out what that means after the deadline passes and the inspector leaves and the bank makes their decision. Even if I lose the land. Especially if you lose the land, because then you'll need someone who understands that you fought for it anyway." Elena's expression softened into something Caleb couldn't quite name. Gratitude mixed with fear, mixed with hope that had been dormant too long. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, let's figure it out." They finished the roof 2 days later, on Tuesday of week 4. The final shingle went on just as sunset painted the sky impossible colors, and standing there looking at what they'd built, Caleb felt the satisfaction that came from work done right. 11 days until inspection. The roof was solid, the frame was true, the foundation would outlast them all. Now they just needed to finish the siding, address the interior bracing, and hope that quality would be enough. Wednesday morning brought clouds the color of slate and a wind that smelled like storm. Caleb checked the weather radar on his phone 3 times during the drive up, watching the system move in from the coast, knowing they had maybe 6 hours before it hit. Elena was already unloading siding boards when he arrived, her movement sharp with urgency. "Radio says heavy rain by afternoon," she called out. "We need to get as much siding up as possible before then." Marcus pulled in right behind Caleb, his truck bed loaded with additional boards they'd ordered 2 days prior. The 3 of them worked without discussion, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over the past 3 weeks. Measure, cut, position, secure. Check for level, adjust, move to the next board. The siding was cedar, expensive but necessary. Original 1947 construction had used cedar, and matching it meant the barn would weather consistently, age uniformly, maintain the integrity that separated restoration from renovation. "Why does it matter if we match the original?" Mia asked. She'd arrived with Sophie an hour after the adults started, both girls moving with the tiredness that came from too many early mornings and too much physical work. Caleb paused in his measuring. "Because when the inspector looks at this barn, he needs to see something that respects what came before. If we slap up vinyl siding or cheap pine, we're telling him we don't care about preservation. We just care about passing inspection. That changes how he evaluates everything else." "So it's psychology," Sophie said. "It's craftsmanship," Elena corrected gently, "which becomes psychology when someone's making judgments about whether you did things right." They worked steadily through the morning, racing the incoming weather. The siding went up in courses, each board overlapping the one below, creating the horizontal lines that would shed water and resist wind. Caleb had calculated the reveal, the amount of exposed board, to exactly match the original construction, using photographs Elena had found from the 1950s to verify the measurements. Around 11, the first drop started. Light at first, almost apologetic, then building into the steady pour that mountain storms specialized in. They'd managed to side 3 of the 4 walls, leaving only the north face exposed. "Tarp it," Caleb ordered. They scrambled to secure heavy plastic sheeting over the exposed section, fighting wind that wanted to tear everything from their hands. The tarp snapped and billowed, nearly yanking Marcus off his feet before they got it anchored properly. Inside the barn, protected from the rain, They stood catching their breath. Water drummed on the new roof above them, loud, insistent, testing their work. Caleb watched the ceiling, looking for any sign of leaks, any evidence that their roofing had failed. Nothing. The roof held. Dry as a courthouse, Marcus observed with satisfaction. Elena was walking the perimeter, checking joints, examining the places where new work met old structure. Her attention to detail had sharpened over the past 3 weeks, her eye trained by repetition and Caleb's patient instruction. The northeast corner, she said. This brace is flexing more than the others. Caleb moved to examine it. She was right. The lateral brace they'd installed showed slight movement when pressed, indicating the connection wasn't as solid as it needed to be. Good catch, he said. We'll reinforce it this afternoon. Will the inspector notice? Maybe, maybe not. But we'll notice, and that's what matters. The rain continued through lunch, through the afternoon, into evening. They worked inside, addressing the bracing issue Elena had identified, installing additional hurricane ties, upgrading connections to standards that exceeded code requirements. The interior work was technical, requiring precision and engineering knowledge that Caleb had accumulated over 30 years. He explained each decision to Mia as he made it, showing her why certain angles mattered, how forces distributed through a structure, the way that understanding physics made better carpentry. It's like everything's connected, Mia said, watching him install a steel bracket. Change one thing and it affects everything else. Exactly. That's why shortcuts fail. You can't cheat one connection and expect the rest of the structure to compensate. Eventually, the weak point gives and everything fails. Sophie was documenting the work on her phone, taking photos and videos for a project she was doing on sustainable building practices. My professor's going to love this, she said. Most restoration projects just slap historic facades on modern construction. This is actually preserving the original engineering. That was the deal, Elena said. Build it right or don't build it at all. The rain finally stopped around 7 that evening, leaving the world smelling of wet cedar and fresh earth. They emerged from the barn to find the mountains wrapped in mist, the clearing transformed into something ethereal and strange. Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from the lumber supplier. The final siding order, enough to complete the north wall, wouldn't arrive until Friday. 2 days lost. He showed Elena the message. Her face went still. That puts us finishing siding on Saturday, she said, 5 days before inspection. We still need to address electrical, install the main door, clean up the interior, document everything for the inspector. It's tight, Caleb admitted, but possible. Possible isn't the same as probable. Marcus had been listening while coiling extension cords. I can work through the weekend. My kitchen remodel can wait another week. I'm here too, Mia said quickly. Spring break's over, but I can skip Friday. It's just review day before exams anyway. Caleb started to object. Mia's education mattered more than a barn, but the look on his daughter's face stopped him. This wasn't about the building. It was about being part of something that mattered, about proving she could commit and follow through. Friday only, he said. You're not missing exams. Mia nodded, and Caleb saw Elena watching them both with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what was happening in this exchange. That night, after dropping Mia at home, Caleb drove back to the mountain. He told himself it was to check the tarps, to make sure nothing had come loose in the wind. But when he pulled up to the cabin and saw light in the windows, he knew he'd come for different reasons. Elena opened the door before he knocked. Couldn't stay away, she asked, but there was no judgment in it. Wanted to make sure the site was secure. The site's fine. Come in. The cabin's interior surprised him. Warm wood paneling, furniture that looked handmade, books everywhere. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the whole place smelled like coffee and something baking. Sophie's at a friend's house, Elena said, pouring him coffee without asking. Studying for finals, which means I'm alone with my thoughts, and that's never good this close to a deadline. Caleb accepted the mug, grateful for the warmth. What are you thinking about? Whether I'm being selfish, asking you and Marcus and even our daughters to sacrifice this much for something that might not matter in the end. It matters, Caleb said. Maybe not to the bank or the inspector or anyone who looks at this as just a property dispute. But it matters to you and to Sophie and to everyone who's ever watched something they loved get taken by systems that don't care about value beyond dollars. Elena sat down across from him, firelight playing across her features. My husband used to say I fought too hard for things, that I couldn't let anything go, even when letting go was the smart choice. Was he right? Probably. I kept teaching at a school that was cutting programs and burning out staff because I thought one person could make a difference. I spent 2 years fighting my father's insurance company over treatments they should have covered instead of accepting that some battles are designed to exhaust you into surrender. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. But I can't seem to learn. Can't seem to accept that sometimes the system wins and fighting just means you lose slower. Caleb thought about his own history of walking away, from his marriage when it got hard, from emotional connection after Sarah left, from anything that required vulnerability instead of craftsmanship. He'd spent 3 years believing that retreat was wisdom, that protecting yourself was the same as being strong. Maybe fighting isn't about winning, he said. Maybe it's about proving you cared enough to try, that you didn't let them take it without making them work for it. That sounds like a justification for futility. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way we maintain dignity in a world that's constantly asking us to accept less than we deserve. Elena looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, recognition, understanding, the particular intimacy that comes from being seen clearly by another person. "Stay for dinner," she said. "I made too much anyway." Dinner was pot roast with vegetables from her garden, bread she'd baked that morning, wine from a vineyard 2 valleys over. They ate at a table her father had built, using plates her grandmother had carried west in 1946, surrounded by the accumulated history of her family's time in these mountains. "Tell me about your grandfather," Elena said. "The one who taught you carpentry." Caleb smiled, remembering. He was Norwegian, came over in the 30s, worked logging camps and lumber mills before starting his own shop, built furniture for rich people in Portland but lived like he was still in the camps, said the work was what mattered, not the money. Sounds like someone else I know. He taught me that wood has memory, that how you treat it during construction affects how it behaves for decades afterward. Rush the drying, accept warped boards, skip the proper joinery. The piece will fail eventually because you didn't respect the material. "Did he know your wife?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "Sarah?" "No, he died when I was 23, long before I met her." "Why?" Elena hesitated, then continued carefully. "Because I wonder what he would have thought about someone who didn't respect what you were building. Your marriage, your family, the life you were trying to create." Caleb felt the observation settle into his chest, heavy and true. He would have said I was using wood grain to justify emotional distance, that I was building perfect furniture while letting the relationships that mattered go untended. And was he right? Probably. Sarah asked me once if I loved my work more than I loved her. I said that was a false choice. But the truth is, work was safer. Wood doesn't leave, doesn't change its mind about whether you're enough. Elena nodded slowly. After my husband died, I told myself I was focusing on taking care of my father because that's what family did. But really, I was hiding. Grief was too big to face, so I made myself busy enough to avoid feeling it. Did it work? No, just delayed it. And now here I am, fighting for a barn because I still can't face the fact that everyone I built my life around is gone. The honesty in her voice, the rawness of it, made Caleb want to reach across the table and take her hand. He didn't, not yet. But the impulse itself felt significant. "You're not fighting for the barn," he said. "You're fighting for the right to choose what happens next. And that's not the same as hiding. Isn't it?" "No. Hiding is what I've been doing for 3 years. Keeping Mia at arm's length, refusing to date, building walls I told myself were boundaries. You're doing the opposite. You're staying, planting roots, demanding that the world make space for what you value." Elena's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I'm terrified that it won't be enough, that I'll lose anyway." "Then you lose. But you'll lose knowing you fought for something that mattered, and that's more than most people can say." They finished dinner in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require filling with words. Afterward, Elena walked Caleb out to his truck. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like salt on black cloth. "Thank you," Elena said. "For coming back. For saying what I needed to hear. Thank you for dinner. And the company." She smiled. And Caleb saw the girl she must have been, quick to laugh, slow to give up. Someone who believed the world could be better if you worked hard enough. "See you tomorrow," she said. Tomorrow. He drove home thinking about wood grain and memory, about the ways people shaped each other through proximity and care, about whether he had the courage to let someone in after 3 years of fortification. Thursday and Friday crawled past in a blur of technical work and mounting pressure. The siding arrived late Friday, which meant they couldn't start the north wall until Saturday morning. Mia showed up despite having exams the following week, her presence a quiet declaration that this mattered more than test scores. The north wall went up in record time, all of them working with the desperate efficiency of people who knew the deadline was no longer theoretical. By Saturday evening, the barn was fully sided, sealed against weather, structurally sound. Sunday, they addressed the electrical. The original barn had never been wired, but county code required basic lighting and outlets for any structure intended for use. Caleb subcontracted an electrician he trusted, a woman named Patricia, who'd been doing commercial work for 20 years. She arrived, surveyed the barn, and whistled low. "This is beautiful work. Whoever did this knows what they're doing." "That's the goal," Caleb said. Patricia spent 6 hours running conduit, installing boxes, connecting circuits that met modern safety standards while remaining as invisible as possible. She refused payment beyond materials, saying she'd rather be part of this project than another strip mall renovation. "The world needs more of this," she said before leaving. "Buildings that matter." Monday brought the main door, 12 feet tall, built from reclaimed barnwood Caleb had been storing for the right project. He and Marcus hung it on custom hinges forged by a blacksmith 2 counties over, hardware that would last another century. When the door swung closed for the first time, fitting perfectly into its frame, Elena actually teared up. "My father would have loved this," she said. Tuesday, they cleaned. Every surface, every corner, every trace of construction debris. The barn's interior revealed itself, soaring height, beautiful framing, the play of light through gaps they'd intentionally preserved. It looked old and new simultaneously, honoring history while meeting modern standards. Wednesday morning, 3 days before inspection, Caleb walked the entire structure with a checklist and a measuring tape. He tested every connection, examined every joint, looked for any detail that might fail scrutiny. He found nothing. The work was flawless. That afternoon, a black SUV pulled up to the property. 2 men in suits emerged, one carrying a briefcase, both wearing expressions that Caleb recognized from every bad interaction he'd ever had with bureaucracy. Elena came out of the cabin, and Caleb saw her spine straighten, her shoulders square. "Miss Moore," the older man said. "I'm Robert Chen, Senior Loan Officer with Mountain States Bank. This is my colleague, James Morrison, from our legal department." "Gentlemen," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "How can I help you?" Chen glanced toward the barn, his expression showing nothing. "We're here to discuss the status of your loan and the upcoming inspection. The inspection is Saturday. The barn will pass. That remains to be seen. However, the bank has concerns about the feasibility of this project. Our assessor's report suggested significant structural issues that may not be resolvable within the timeline specified in your loan modification agreement." Caleb saw where this was going. They were preemptively arguing that even if the barn passed inspection, it shouldn't count because the work was too extensive, too rushed, too something. "Mr. Chen," Caleb said, stepping forward. "I'm Caleb Wright, the contractor on this project. I've documented every phase of construction, and I can assure you the work exceeds county code in every measurable way." Chen's attention shifted to him. "And you're willing to stake your professional reputation on that?" "I am." "Even though the timeline was impossibly compressed?" "The timeline was aggressive, not impossible, and we didn't cut corners to meet it. Every decision prioritized long-term integrity over short-term expedience." Morrison spoke for the first time. "Mr. Wright, the bank's position is that restoration of this scope should have taken 4 to 6 months, not 4 weeks. The speed of completion raises questions about quality." Caleb felt anger rising, but kept his voice level. "The speed of completion reflects skilled labor, proper planning, and commitment to the project. If you're suggesting I've done substandard work, I invite you to bring your own inspector right now. We'll walk through every detail together." Chen and Morrison exchanged glances. They hadn't expected resistance, hadn't anticipated that the contractor would challenge them directly. "That won't be necessary," Chen said. "The county inspector will make his determination on Saturday. However, I want to be clear that even if the structure passes inspection, the bank reserves the right to review the overall viability of continuing this loan." "On what grounds?" Elena demanded. "On the grounds that your financial situation hasn't improved sufficiently to justify our continued exposure. The barn represents emotional value, Ms. Moore, but not necessarily market value. My father paid on this loan for 15 years, under terms that changed when his health status changed. Those are the facts of the contract." Elena's hands curled into fists, and Caleb saw her fighting the urge to say something she couldn't take back. He stepped closer, a subtle positioning that communicated solidarity. "Mr. Chen," Caleb said quietly, "you should know that if this loan proceeds to foreclosure, I'll be providing testimony about the bank's conduct throughout this process, including the timing of your assessment visit, the acceleration of foreclosure proceedings, and your current attempt to preemptively discredit work that meets or exceeds all applicable standards." Chen's expression hardened. "Are you threatening litigation?" "I'm stating facts. Ms. Moore has fulfilled her obligations under the loan modification agreement. The barn will pass inspection. If the bank forecloses anyway, it will be because you've decided profit matters more than honoring the terms of your own contract." Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then spoke quietly to Chen. Whatever the message said, it changed the dynamic. Chen turned back to Elena. "The inspection stands. If the barn passes, we'll reconvene to discuss next steps." "That's all I'm asking," Elena said. The men left, their SUV kicking up dust as it descended the mountain road. Elena waited until they were out of sight before her knees buckled. Caleb caught her, steadied her. "They're going to foreclose anyway," she said, her voice breaking. "Even if we pass inspection, they'll find another reason." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But you heard Morrison's reaction when I mentioned testimony. They're worried about exposure. Banks hate bad publicity." "So what do we do?" "We pass inspection first. Then we make them justify foreclosure in a way that doesn't make them look like predators." Elena nodded, pulling herself together. "Okay. 3 more days. We make this perfect." They spent those 3 days doing exactly that. Every surface got final inspection. Every measurement got rechecked. They photographed everything, documented every material choice, prepared a presentation folder that detailed the entire restoration process. Friday evening, the night before inspection, they gathered in the barn one last time. Caleb, Elena, Marcus, Mia, Sophie, and Patricia the electrician who'd come back to double-check her work. "This is it," Elena said, looking around at what they'd built. "Tomorrow, we find out if it was enough." Mia walked over to one of the main support beams, running her hand along the wood. "It's beautiful," she said. "Like really beautiful. Even if the inspector's a jerk, we know we did something amazing." "Your daughter's wise," Marcus told Caleb. "She gets it from her grandfather," Caleb replied, but his eyes were on Mia with pride that didn't need words. Sophie was crying quietly, and Elena pulled her close. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we tried. We fought for this with everything we had." "I know, Mom. I just wish Grandpa could see it." "Maybe he can," Elena said. "Or maybe it doesn't matter because we built this to honor what he believed, that work done right lasts." They stood together in the fading light, 6 people who'd become something like family through shared labor and impossible deadlines. The barn rose around them, solid and true, a testament to what happens when people choose quality over ease, commitment over convenience. Tomorrow, an inspector would arrive with his clipboard and his codes and his authority to determine their fate. But tonight, in this moment, they'd already won something more important. They'd built something that would last. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of silence that precedes judgment. Caleb woke at 4, unable to sleep, his mind running through every detail of the barn's construction, searching for the flaw he might have missed. He dressed in darkness, made coffee he didn't taste, and was on the road by 5. Elena's cabin showed lights when he arrived, smoke rising from the chimney into air so still it barely moved. She emerged before he reached the door, already dressed, her hair pulled back, eyes showing the same sleeplessness he felt. "Couldn't wait either?" she asked. "Figured we should do one last walkthrough before he arrives." They moved through the barn together as dawn broke, checking connections they'd already checked a dozen times, testing doors that opened perfectly, examining joints that would outlast them both. The morning light streaming through the high windows revealed every detail of what they'd built. The precision of the framing, the care in the siding, the marriage of old timber and new wood that spoke of respect rather than replacement. "It's perfect," Elena said, but her voice carried doubt underneath the words. "Perfect doesn't matter if the inspector's already decided to fail us." "You think he will?" Caleb thought about the bank's visit, about Chen's barely concealed hostility, about the way systems protected themselves by punishing those who challenged them. "I think we're about to find out whether quality actually matters, or if the game was rigged from the start." Marcus arrived at 8, carrying a box of pastries from a bakery 40 miles away. "Figured we should have something to stress eat," he said. Sophie and Mia showed up together, both dressed more formally than Caleb had ever seen them. Sophie in a sweater and clean jeans, Mia in a dress she'd insisted on wearing despite Caleb's surprise. "If this is a funeral or a celebration, I want to look right either way," Mia explained. At 10:30, Patricia pulled up in her work van. "Wanted to be here in case there are questions about the electrical. That's my certification on the line, too." They waited. The barn stood behind them, silent and solid, while the minutes crawled toward 11. Caleb found himself studying Elena's profile, the set of her jaw, the way her hands kept finding each other, the tension visible in her shoulders. 4 weeks ago, she'd been a stranger asking an impossible question. Now the thought of her losing this fight felt personal in a way that had nothing to do with carpentry. At 10:58, a county truck appeared on the access road. White, official, carrying the seal that gave its occupant authority over their months of work. It parked near the barn, and a man in his 60s climbed out, carrying a tablet, a measuring tape, and the weathered expression of someone who'd seen every shortcut and deception construction could offer. His name was Thomas Garfield, and Caleb recognized him from reputation, fair but exacting, impossible to charm, allergic to anything that didn't meet code precisely. If you were going to get an inspector who couldn't be influenced, Garfield was the one you'd choose. If you were hoping for lenience, he was your nightmare. "Ms. Moore," Garfield said, shaking Elena's hand with professional courtesy. "Shall we begin?" "Please," Elena said, and Caleb heard the tremor she was fighting to hide. Garfield started with the exterior, walking the perimeter with slow deliberation. He examined the foundation, checking for settling, looking for gaps or failures in the mortar. He tested siding boards for rot, pulled on them to verify they were properly secured. He studied the roof from every angle, making notes on his tablet that revealed nothing about his thoughts. Caleb and Elena followed at a respectful distance while the others waited near the barn entrance. Garfield worked with the methodical patience of someone who wouldn't be rushed, who'd long ago learned that careful inspection revealed what hurried examination missed. After 20 minutes circling the exterior, Garfield approached the main door. "Original hardware?" he asked, running his hand along the custom hinges. "Reproduction," Caleb said. "Forged to match 1947 specifications, but new steel. Original hinges were too corroded to salvage safely." "But you preserved the originals?" Caleb gestured to where the old hinges hung mounted on the interior wall, labeled and dated. Part of the structure's history. Seemed wrong to discard them. Garfield nodded slightly and made a note. Impossible to tell if that was good or bad. Inside, the inspection intensified. Garfield tested every beam, examining joints with a flashlight and knowledge that missed nothing. He measured roof pitch, checked for proper ventilation, verified that the framing could handle the load requirements modern code demanded. He studied the lateral bracing Elena had flagged weeks ago, the reinforced connections Caleb had installed, the hurricane ties that turned the barn into a structure capable of surviving the mountain's worst weather. The electrical inspection took 30 minutes alone. Patricia stood ready to answer questions, but Garfield worked silently, checking circuits, testing outlets, verifying that everything met current safety standards. When he finally spoke, it was only to confirm conduit gauge and ask about the junction box placement. "It's positioned to allow for future expansion," Patricia explained. If Ms. Moore ever wants to add additional lighting or equipment, the infrastructure supports it. Garfield made another note. The silence was unbearable. Caleb felt sweat gathering under his collar despite the cool morning air inside the barn. Beside him, Elena stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her, breathing controlled like she was managing pain. After 90 minutes, Garfield stepped back and surveyed the entire structure. He stood there long enough that Caleb started to worry something was fundamentally wrong, some flaw so obvious that words weren't necessary. Then Garfield turned to Elena. Walk me through the decision to preserve rather than replace. It wasn't a question Caleb had expected. Elena blinked, clearly surprised. My grandfather built this barn, she said carefully. My father maintained it for 50 years. The structure represents my family's belief that you build things to last, that craftsmanship matters more than convenience. When I had to choose between quick replacement or difficult restoration, the choice was obvious. Restore what they built. Honor how they built it. Even knowing restoration would cost more, take longer, create greater risk of failure? Especially knowing that. Because building right has never been about taking the easy path. Garfield studied her for a long moment, then turned to Caleb. Your background check shows 30 years in carpentry, specialty in timber framing and historical restoration. You've never had a failed inspection. No, sir. Why take this job? The timeline was absurd, the budget insufficient, the consequences of failure significant. Caleb chose his words carefully. Because Miss Moore asked one question that made me realize I'd spent 3 years building structures while avoiding the harder work of building relationships. This barn was a chance to do both, create something that would last while connecting with people who valued the same things I did. And did you cut corners to meet the deadline? No, sir. Every decision prioritized long-term integrity. If anything, we exceeded code requirements because we knew we'd only get one chance at inspection. Garfield looked between them, his expression still revealing nothing. Then he pulled up something on his tablet, scrolled through what appeared to be photographs. I received a call 3 days ago from Mountain States Bank, he said. Senior loan officer named Chen. He suggested I pay particular attention to this inspection, implied that the work had been rushed, that structural integrity might be compromised. Caleb felt his stomach drop. The bank had tried to poison the inspection before it even happened. He sent me photos from an assessment visit, Garfield continued, showing incomplete framing, exposed roof deck, general construction chaos, suggested the whole project was amateur hour. Elena's face had gone pale. Those photos were taken mid-construction. I know, Garfield interrupted, because I've been doing this job for 34 years, and I know the difference between active construction and shoddy work. I also know when someone's trying to manipulate an inspection outcome. He turned his tablet around, showing them his own photos, detailed shots of every joint, every connection, every detail of the barn's construction. This is exceptional work. The foundation exceeds code requirements by 20%. The framing shows craftsmanship I haven't seen outside of historical preservation projects. The lateral bracing is engineered for wind loads 50% higher than required for this elevation. Caleb felt something release in his chest, but Garfield wasn't finished. The electrical is textbook perfect. The roofing will last 40 years. The siding installation shows understanding of both historical technique and modern building science. He paused, looking directly at Elena. This barn is better than code. It's better than most new construction I inspect. It's a model for how restoration should be done. Elena's hand found Caleb's, gripped it hard enough to hurt. However, Garfield continued, and Caleb felt his brief relief evaporate, there is one issue we need to address. The silence stretched unbearably. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities. Something they'd missed, some code requirement they'd overlooked, some detail that would unravel everything. The door header, Garfield said, pointing to the main entrance. It's supporting significant load from the roof structure above it. Code requires a minimum 4x12 beam for that span. You've installed a 4x14. Caleb waited for the other shoe to drop. That's a problem, Garfield said, because it means I have to note in my report that you've exceeded code requirements, which is going to make every other inspector in this county look bad by comparison. It took Caleb a moment to process what he was hearing. Garfield was smiling, barely, but definitely smiling. The barn passes inspection, Garfield said formally. I'll file my report this afternoon. The county will issue your certificate of compliance within 3 business days. He extended his hand to Elena. Congratulations, Ms. Moore. Your grandfather would be proud. Elena shook his hand, but no words came out. Her eyes were wet, her breathing unsteady. Garfield turned to Caleb. And you, Mr. Wright, this is career-defining work. If you're taking on other restoration projects, I'd appreciate being kept in the loop. We need more contractors who understand that building code is a minimum standard, not a target. Thank you, sir, Caleb managed. Garfield packed his equipment with the same methodical care he'd used during inspection. Before leaving, he paused at the entrance. One more thing. When the bank's loan officer called trying to prejudice this inspection, I told him I'd note his interference in my report to the county. Attempting to manipulate a code inspector is a serious ethics violation. I don't know what his problem is with you, Ms. Moore, but he's going to have his own problems to deal with now. He left, his truck disappearing down the mountain road in a cloud of dust that caught the midday sun. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sophie broke the silence with a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, the tension releasing in a flood of relief and disbelief and pure exhausted joy. Marcus was shaking Caleb's hand. Patricia was hugging Elena. Mia was jumping around like she was 8 years old instead of 12. The barn stood around them, validated and official and permanent in a way that transcended the inspector's approval. Elena pulled away from the group, walked to the center of the barn, and stood there looking up at the rafters. Caleb followed, giving her space but staying close. We did it, she said quietly. You did it. This was your fight. No. She turned to face him. This was ours, all of ours. I asked for help and people showed up. That's not something I knew how to do before. Caleb understood what she meant. Asking for help required admitting you couldn't do everything alone, required trusting that people might actually care enough to sacrifice for something that wasn't theirs. He'd forgotten how to do that too, had spent 3 years believing that self-sufficiency was the same as strength. So what happens now? He asked. Now I call the bank and inform them the barn passed inspection. Then I wait to see if they honor the loan modification agreement or try to find another way to foreclose. When will you know? They have to respond within 10 business days. 2 weeks of wondering if the fight's actually over or just entering a new phase. Caleb wanted to promise her it would work out, that the bank would back down, that winning this battle meant winning the war. But he'd learned enough about Elena to know she valued honesty over reassurance. Whatever they decide, he said, you've got documentation proving you met every requirement. You've got an inspector willing to testify that their loan officer tried to corrupt the process. And you've got people who'll stand with you if this goes to court. People like you? Especially like me. Elena smiled, and Caleb saw exhaustion and hope warring in her expression. I need to tell you something, she said, about why I really asked if you were married. I thought it was about understanding loss. It was, but it was also about understanding what happens after loss. Whether you let it define you forever, or whether you eventually risk building something new. Caleb's throat tightened. And what did you decide? That I wanted to find out if it was possible. If someone could show up, really show up, and not disappear when things got difficult. I'm not going anywhere, Caleb said. I know. That's what scares me. Because now I have to figure out what comes next, and I haven't let myself think that far ahead in 5 years. Before Caleb could respond, Mia appeared beside them, slightly breathless from whatever celebration the others were conducting outside. Dad, Marcus wants to take everyone to lunch in town. Celebrate properly. You coming? Caleb looked at Elena, who nodded. Yeah, he said. We're coming. They drove down the mountain in a caravan, Marcus leading in his truck, Patricia following, Sophie and Mia riding together in Elena's vehicle, Caleb bringing up the rear. The restaurant Marcus chose was the kind of place that served breakfast all day and knew everyone's order before they sat down. They crowded into a corner booth, a mismatched group brought together by shared work and impossible deadlines. The waitress took their orders with the patience of someone who'd seen every kind of celebration and crisis these mountains produced. To the barn, Marcus said, raising his coffee cup. And to proving that quality still matters. They drank to that, and to Elena's grandfather, and to stubbornness in the face of systems designed to crush it. The food came, eggs and pancakes and bacon and hash browns, the kind of calories their bodies needed after weeks of physical labor. Caleb watched Mia talking with Sophie, saw his daughter animated in a way she rarely was anymore, gesturing with her fork as she explained something about lateral load distribution. He caught Elena watching them too, something soft in her expression. "They're good kids," Patricia observed. "Both of them. You should be proud." "I am," Elena and Caleb said simultaneously, then laughed at the timing. The meal stretched into 2 hours, nobody in a hurry to leave, the restaurant staff patient with their lingering. Eventually, though, reality reasserted itself. Patricia had another job to get to, Marcus needed to check on his kitchen remodel, and Caleb had promised Mia they'd tackle her exam studying that evening. They said their goodbyes in the parking lot, promises to stay in touch, acknowledgments that what they'd built together went beyond the barn itself. Patricia extracted promises from Elena and Caleb both to call her for future projects. Marcus shook hands with everyone, his usual quiet reserve cracking into genuine warmth. "If you need anything," he told Elena, "anything at all with the bank situation, you call. I've got friends who know lawyers, and I'm not afraid to make noise." "Thank you," Elena said, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. None of us could have done it alone. That was kind of the point." Driving home, Mia was quiet in the passenger seat, staring out the window at landscape rolling past. Caleb let the silence sit, knowing his daughter well enough to recognize when she was processing rather than retreating. Finally, she spoke. "Are you and Elena together now?" The question was direct in the way only 12-year-olds managed. No pretense, no social cushioning, just the truth of what she'd observed. "I don't know," Caleb said honestly. "We're figuring it out." "Do you want to be?" Caleb thought about how to answer that, then decided his daughter deserved the same honesty she'd given him. "Yeah, I do, but it's complicated. She's still dealing with the bank, still processing what comes next. And I haven't exactly been good at relationships since your mom left." Mia nodded slowly. "I like her, and Sophie's cool. I wouldn't hate it if they were around more." The permission implicit in those words hit Caleb harder than he'd expected. For 3 years, he'd told himself he was protecting Mia by not dating, by keeping their life simple and predictable. But maybe what he'd actually been doing was protecting himself, using his daughter as an excuse to avoid risk. "That means a lot," he said. "Thank you. But if you hurt Elena the way Mom hurt us, I'll be really disappointed in you." "That's fair. I'll do my best not to." They spent the evening going over Mia's chemistry notes, Caleb helping where he could, and admitting when the material exceeded his knowledge. Around 9, Mia's phone buzzed with a text from Sophie, and suddenly his daughter was smiling at the screen in a way that made Caleb simultaneously happy and terrified about impending teenage years. "Sophie says her mom's been crying on and off since we left the restaurant," Mia reported. "Happy crying, but still. It's been a big day." "Yeah." Mia looked up from her phone. "Dad? I'm proud of you, for helping, for not walking away when it got hard." Caleb felt his chest constrict. "I'm proud of you too. You worked harder on that barn than I've seen you work on anything." It felt like it mattered. School's just homework and tests, but the barn was real. Something we built that'll still be there when we're old. That's the thing about construction. It's one of the few jobs where you can point at something and say, "I made that." It's tangible in a way most work isn't. Mia went back to her notes, but Caleb could see she was thinking about more than chemistry. He recognized the look. It was the same one he'd worn at 15 when his grandfather had taught him the difference between work that paid bills and work that built legacy. Sunday, Caleb spent catching up on the jobs he'd pushed aside to focus on the barn. A deck repair that had been waiting 3 weeks, a fence replacement he'd promised to finish before spring, the accumulated maintenance of a one-man carpentry business. The work was familiar and easy, requiring hands but not heart, and he found himself missing the barn's complexity, the way each day had brought new challenges that demanded innovation. Around 6, his phone rang. Elena. "They responded," she said without preamble. Caleb's pulse spiked. "And?" "Conference call tomorrow at 2. Me, Chen, someone from their legal department, and a regional manager I've never heard of. They want to discuss the path forward." "That's vague." Deliberately. But Garfield's report got filed this afternoon. The county called to congratulate me and mentioned they'd received a complaint about bank interference. So the bank knows they can't claim the barn failed inspection, which means they're either backing down or escalating. No middle ground. Exactly. Elena's voice carried exhaustion underneath the words. I'm trying not to catastrophize, but I keep imagining they've found some other clause, some technical violation that gives them cover to foreclose anyway. Want company tomorrow? I can be there for the call. You don't have to. I know, I want to. The silence that followed felt charged with everything they hadn't said yet, all the conversations that waited on the other side of knowing whether Elena would keep her land. Okay, Elena said finally. 2:00. Bring coffee. Caleb arrived Monday at 1:30, armed with coffee and the same folder of documentation they'd prepared for Garfield. Elena was already dressed for battle, professional but not formal, the kind of outfit that said she took this seriously without being intimidated by it. Sophie was there too, having driven up from school to provide moral support. She and Mia had apparently been texting, because Mia had sent Elena a message that morning that just said, "Kick their ass," followed by a string of encouraging emojis. Your daughter has a way with words, Elena observed. She gets it from her mother, Caleb deadpanned, which earned a surprised laugh. At 2 precisely, Elena's phone rang. She put it on speaker. Miss Moore, Chen's voice, professionally neutral. I have you on speaker with James Morrison from Legal and Catherine Walsh, our Regional Operations Manager. Mr. Chen, I'm here with my contractor, Caleb Wright, who has documentation of the barn restoration if needed. That won't be necessary. A new voice. Walsh, Caleb assumed. Professional, female, carrying authority. I've reviewed the county inspector's report. The work exceeds code requirements substantially. Yes, Elena said carefully. I've also reviewed Mr. Garfield's notes regarding attempted interference with the inspection process. That's a serious allegation. Silence on the line. Chen didn't respond. Walsh continued. Ms. Moore, I want to apologize on behalf of Mountain States Bank. The handling of your loan modification has not reflected our institutional values or our commitment to community banking relationships. Caleb and Elena exchanged glances. This wasn't the opening they'd expected. The bank is prepared to honor your loan modification agreement, Walsh said. The barn passed inspection, which satisfied the requirement. Your loan will be restructured to its original terms, and the foreclosure proceedings will be withdrawn. Elena's hand found Caleb's under the table, gripped hard. However, Walsh continued, and Caleb braced for the reversal. There are conditions. First, Mr. Chen will no longer be involved in servicing your loan. You'll be assigned a new loan officer. Second, we're requiring a formal apology from our end for the inspection interference. Third, we'd like to discuss potential refinancing options that might lower your monthly payment and provide more flexibility. Elena looked stunned. Thank you. Yes, all of that sounds acceptable. Good. Legal will send over the updated loan documents within 48 hours. Please review them with an attorney before signing, though I believe you'll find the terms favorable. Walsh paused. Miss Moore, for what it's worth, your grandfather banked with us for 40 years. He was a good man, and we should have honored that relationship better when he passed. We're committed to doing better going forward. The call ended with professional courtesies and the particular relief that comes from battle avoided. Elena set down her phone and just stared at it. Did that actually just happen? Sophie asked. I think so, Elena said. I think we won. Caleb felt the reality of it settling in. No more deadlines, no threat of foreclosure. The barn was safe. The land was safe. Elena's fight was over. They caved because of Garfield's report, he said. The inspector interference probably opened them up to regulatory scrutiny they couldn't afford. I don't care why, Elena said. I just care that it's over. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the barn visible across the clearing. Caleb followed, and Sophie gave them privacy by retreating to the kitchen. Thank you, Elena said without turning around. For everything. For saying yes, for the work, for standing here today ready to fight again if necessary. You would have been fine without me. No, I wouldn't have. I would have given up after the first week, convinced myself it was impossible. You made me believe we could actually win. Caleb stepped closer, close enough to see his reflection in the window glass beside hers. You did the believing. I just provided the carpentry. Elena turned to face him, and the distance between them felt suddenly charged with possibility. So what happens now? We've spent 4 weeks in crisis mode, working toward one goal. Now that's done. Do we just go back to our separate lives? Is that what you want? No. Then we don't. He closed the remaining distance and kissed her, gentle and tentative, giving her space to pull back if she wanted. She didn't. Her hands found his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like relief and promise, and the particular rightness that comes from finding someone who sees you clearly. When they separated, Elena was smiling. That was overdue. By about 3 weeks, yeah. We should probably figure out what this means. The logistics of dating when we live 3 hours apart, what we tell our daughters, whether this is just adrenaline from winning or something real. It's real, Caleb said. At least for me. For me too. Elena's smile widened. But we should still figure out the logistics. They spent the afternoon doing exactly that, talking through possibilities and concerns with the same careful planning they'd brought to the barn. The distance was manageable. Caleb could work remotely several days a week. Elena had been considering expanding her garden operation, which would give her flexibility. Their daughters were already friends, already comfortable with each other. It wasn't simple, but simple had never been the goal. What mattered was building something real, something that would last, something worth the effort and risk and vulnerability it required. Just like the barn. The loan documents arrived on Wednesday, exactly as promised. Elena spread them across her kitchen table while Caleb read through each page with the same careful attention he brought to building plans. The terms were better than expected. Interest rate reduced, payment schedule restructured, even a provision allowing her to make improvements to the property without triggering reassessment penalties. This is legitimate, Caleb said after his third read-through. No hidden clauses, no traps I can see. They're actually honoring the agreement. Elena signed the papers that evening with Sophie as witness, and the next morning drove them to a lawyer in town who confirmed what Caleb had already told her. By Friday, the documents were filed, the foreclosure officially withdrawn, and the barn legally secured as part of her property for as long as she wanted to keep it. It's really over, Sophie said that night over dinner. Like, actually over. It is, Elena confirmed, but her voice carried something beyond relief, a kind of wonder, as if she'd been braced for disaster so long that peace felt unfamiliar. Caleb had stayed through the week, working on smaller projects around the property, while Elena handled the legal finalization. He'd repaired the cabin's front steps, replaced rotted boards on the porch, fixed a window that had been stuck for years. Small things, maintenance things. The kind of work that said he was thinking beyond the crisis that had brought them together. Saturday morning, he woke to find Elena already up, standing in the barn with her hands on one of the main support beams. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the structure they'd fought so hard to save. Couldn't sleep? He asked, joining her. Didn't want to. Feels like if I close my eyes, I'll wake up and find out this was temporary, that the bank changed their mind or the inspector made a mistake or something else went wrong. Caleb understood that feeling. The hypervigilance that came from months of crisis, the inability to trust that safety might actually last. He'd lived with it for 3 years after Sarah left, always waiting for the next thing to break. It's real, he said. The barn's safe. The land's yours. You won. Elena turned to face him. We won. I need you to understand that. This wasn't my victory alone. It was yours, Marcus's, our daughters, everyone who showed up and refused to let this place fall. Fair enough. We won. She smiled, and Caleb saw exhaustion beginning to lift from her features, the tight lines around her eyes softening. So now what? We've spent a month building this barn, another week fighting the bank. What do we do when there's no deadline chasing us? We build other things, Caleb said. Slower, better. Things that matter because we choose them, not because we're forced to. Like what? He'd been thinking about this all week during the quiet hours of repair work, in the spaces between legal phone calls and document reviews. I want to teach. Not just Mia, but other people who want to learn real carpentry, timber framing, traditional joinery, the kind of skills that are disappearing because nobody takes time to pass them on anymore. Elena's expression shifted into interest. Where would you teach? Here, if you'd let me. The barn's got space. We could set up a workshop, bring in students for weekend intensives, teach people how to build things that last. You've really thought about this. I have. And I've thought about splitting my time between the mountain and the city, about taking fewer commercial jobs and more restoration projects, about building a life that's less about surviving and more about creating. Elena walked to the barn's center, looking up at the rafters they'd raised together. My father always said this barn should be useful, not just decorative. He hated the idea of old buildings becoming museums, pretty to look at, but dead inside. He wanted structures that worked, that served purposes. What purpose do you want it to serve? I want it to be a place where things grow, not just skills, but community, connection, the kind of relationships that come from working beside someone on something difficult. She turned back to Caleb. I want what we built here to keep building. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. They spent the rest of that morning planning, sketching ideas for workshop spaces, discussing curriculum for carpentry classes, imagining what the property could become if they committed to making it more than just Elena's home. The conversation flowed easily, both of them contributing ideas that built on each other, finding excitement in shared vision. Around noon, Marcus called. How's the famous barn? He asked. Standing, Caleb said. And we're talking about using it for carpentry workshops. You interested in teaching some sessions? Hell yes, when do we start? Give us a month to plan properly, then we'll see. After the call, Elena made lunch while Caleb continued sketching workshop layouts. They ate on the porch, watching clouds move across the mountains, the barn visible in the clearing like proof that impossible things sometimes worked out. I need to tell you something, Elena said after a while. About my husband. Caleb set down his sandwich, giving her his full attention. After he died, I spent 2 years thinking I'd used up my chance at partnership, that I'd had my love story, and asking for another one was greedy, unrealistic. She paused, choosing words carefully. I moved back here telling myself it was about caring for my father, but really it was about hiding, convincing myself that solitude was wisdom instead of fear. And now? Now I'm terrified that I've forgotten how to do this, how to let someone in, how to build a relationship instead of just surviving beside someone. What if I'm too broken? What if losing him broke something that doesn't fix? Caleb thought about his own 3 years of emotional fortification, the walls he'd built that Elena had somehow walked through without him noticing. I don't think you're broken. I think you're careful. And careful isn't the same as incapable. How do you know? Because you asked for help when you needed it. Because you trusted me with something that mattered more than pride or self-protection. That's not broken behavior. That's courage. Elena's eyes glistened. I'm going to mess this up sometimes. Pull away when I should lean in, protect myself when I should be vulnerable. Same. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that emotional distance was the same as strength. I'm going to default to that when things get hard. So we're both disasters waiting to happen? Caleb laughed. More like we're both works in progress who've learned that asking for help isn't weakness. That actually sounds hopeful. It is. We just have to keep choosing it. The conversation settled into comfortable silence after that, both of them watching the afternoon light change across the mountains. Eventually, Elena spoke again, her voice quieter. My husband proposed to me in a barn. Different state, but still. We were at a wedding, dancing, and he pulled me outside where it was quiet. Said he'd spent 6 months trying to find the perfect moment, the right words, but standing there with hay in my hair and my shoes off, he realized perfect wasn't the point. Showing up was. Sounds like a smart man. He was. And I think he'd like you. He'd appreciate that you build things to last, that you showed up when I asked, that you're not trying to replace what I lost, but helping me build something new. Caleb felt the weight of that, being measured against a dead man's memory, being found acceptable for reasons that honored both past and present. I hope I can live up to that. You already are. Sunday, Mia and Sophie drove up together, arriving with a carload of supplies and announcement that they'd planned a barn celebration. They'd invited Marcus, Patricia, even Inspector Garfield, who'd apparently told Sophie he'd be honored to attend. "You planned a party without telling me?" Elena asked, but she was smiling. "You've spent a month stressed about deadlines and banks," Sophie said. "Someone needed to plan something fun." The celebration that afternoon was simple but perfect. Grilled food, music from a portable speaker, people gathered in the barn they'd saved together. Garfield arrived with his wife, a retired teacher who interrogated Caleb about the workshop idea with the enthusiasm of someone who believed education mattered everywhere it happened. "Carpentry should be taught in schools," she declared, "not just for careers but for the discipline, the patience, the understanding that quality takes time." "She's been saying that for 30 years, Garfield added with affection. Marcus brought his girlfriend, a landscape architect who immediately started sketching ideas for gardens around the barn, native plantings that would stabilize soil and attract pollinators. Patricia arrived with her partner and 2 teenage sons who peppered Caleb with questions about apprenticeships and trade careers. The barn filled with conversation and laughter, with people who'd been strangers a month ago but were connected now through shared work and impossible deadlines. Standing at the edge of it, watching Mia and Sophie showing the younger boys how to properly swing a hammer, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the work itself, but the community that came from working beside people towards something that mattered. He'd spent 3 years telling himself that isolation was efficiency, that emotional distance protected him from disappointment. But looking at what they'd built, both the physical barn and the relationships that had formed around it, he realized protection had just been another word for loneliness. Elena found him as the sun started setting, the party winding down into quieter conversations. "Thank you for this," she said. "Sophie and Mia planned it, not me. Not just the party, all of it. For saying yes when I asked, for not walking away when it got hard, for helping me remember that asking for help isn't surrender." Caleb pulled her close, and they stood watching their daughters laughing with Marcus's girlfriend about something, watching the people who'd shown up because a barn mattered and community mattered, and sometimes fighting for something difficult was worth it. "I need to tell Mia we're together," Caleb said. "Officially. She knows, but we should make it explicit. Sophie too, though I think they've already planned our wedding." "Already?" Elena laughed. "Sophie mentioned something about barn venues and how convenient that we'd already renovated one. We've been dating for approximately a week. 5 weeks if you count from when we met. But yes, our daughters are optimistic." Caleb found he didn't mind their optimism. After 3 years of carefully managed expectations, of protecting himself from hope, having people believe in his future felt like permission to believe in it himself. The party ended as mountain parties did, slowly, with long goodbyes and promises to stay connected. Marcus extracted commitments for the first workshop weekend. Patricia volunteered to handle electrical for any future barn improvements. Garfield's wife got Caleb's number for a curriculum consultation about hands-on learning. When everyone had finally left, when it was just the 4 of them, Caleb, Elena, Mia, and Sophie, they sat in the barn one last time as the light faded. "This feels like an ending," Mia observed. "More like a beginning," Sophie corrected. "The barn was just the first thing. Now we figure out what comes next." Elena looked at Caleb. "Any thoughts on what comes next?" He considered the question seriously. A month ago, his life had been predictable, controlled, emotionally safe in the way that came from refusing to risk anything. Now he was sitting in a barn he'd helped save, with a woman he was falling for, 2 daughters who'd become friends, and a future that felt suddenly full of possibility instead of obligation. "I think we keep building," he said. "We run the workshops. We teach people carpentry. We create the kind of community that shows up when someone needs help. And we do it together, as a team, because that's what works." "That sounds good," Elena said. "Really good." They sat in silence after that, watching night claim the mountains, the barn solid and safe around them. Caleb thought about all the moments that had led here. Elena's phone call, his decision to drive up despite every instinct telling him to refuse, the first time he'd really looked at Mia and seen how much she needed him to stop hiding behind work. He thought about the barn itself, how they'd torn it down to its bones before building it back stronger, how that process mirrored what he'd been doing internally for 4 weeks, stripping away the protection he'd built, examining what was solid underneath, choosing to rebuild with honesty instead of fear. "Dad?" Mia's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you happy? Like, actually happy, not just going through motions?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Caleb looked at his daughter, 12 years old, perceptive beyond her age, brave enough to ask what others only wondered. "Yeah," he said. "I am. For the first time in 3 years, I'm actually happy." Mia smiled, and Caleb saw relief in her expression that suggested she'd been carrying worry about him longer than he'd realized. "Good. You deserve that." Sophie nudged Elena. "What about you, Mom? Are you happy?" Elena's hand found Caleb's in the darkness. "I'm getting there. It's scary, letting myself hope again. But yeah, I think I'm happy too." The 4 of them stayed in the barn until full dark, reluctant to leave the space that had become sacred through shared effort. Finally, Cole drove them to the cabin where Elena made hot chocolate, and they played cards until Sophie and Mia were falling asleep at the table. Caleb drove Mia home that night, the mountain road familiar now after weeks of travel. His daughter dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted but content, and Caleb found himself already planning next weekend's return, not because of a deadline or crisis, but because this was where he wanted to be. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than desperate. Caleb worked his city jobs during the week, spent weekends at the mountain helping Elena develop the workshop space. They converted one section of the barn into a teaching area, installed workbenches Marcus had built, organized tools with the precision Caleb brought to everything. Mia came along most weekends, often bringing friends who were curious about carpentry. Elena taught them basics while Caleb handled advanced techniques, and they discovered they made good teaching partners. Elena patient with beginners, Caleb exacting with those ready for complexity. Sophie visited when school allowed, documenting the workshops for a sustainability project that had expanded into her senior thesis. She interviewed students about why they wanted to learn traditional building methods, compiled research on craft education and community resilience. "This could be a model," she told Elena and Caleb one evening. "Not just for carpentry, but for any skill that's disappearing. Bring people to places that matter, teach them things that last, build community through shared work." "Your grandfather would love that," Elena said. "He'd love all of this. The barn saved, the land protected, his daughter happy again." Sophie's voice caught slightly. "I wish he could have seen it." Elena pulled her close. "Maybe he can. Or maybe it doesn't matter because we're living the values he taught us. Building things that last, helping people who ask, choosing quality over convenience." The first official workshop happened in May, 6 weeks after the barn had passed inspection. 12 students showed up, ranging from a retired engineer wanting to learn timber framing to a 20-year-old woman considering carpentry as a career. Marcus co-taught with Caleb, their combined expertise creating a curriculum that was both technically rigorous and practically accessible. They spent the weekend building a small storage shed using traditional joinery methods, each student responsible for specific components. Caleb watched them struggle with mortise and tenon joints, saw frustration give way to satisfaction when pieces finally fit together perfectly. "This is what I've been missing," one student said, a man in his 50s who worked in tech. "Everything in my job is virtual, temporary. This is real. It'll still be here when I'm gone." By Sunday evening, the shed stood complete. Not perfect, but solid. Built with care by people learning that craftsmanship mattered. The students took photos, exchanged contact information, promised to come back for the next workshop. After they left, Caleb, Elena, Marcus, and the girls stood looking at what had been created, not just the shed, but the beginning of something larger. "This could actually work," Marcus said. "The workshop model. People want to learn this." "Then we keep doing it," Caleb said. "One weekend at a time, teaching people that quality still matters." Summer brought more workshops, more students, a growing reputation for the barn as a place where serious craft happened. Elena expanded her garden, started selling vegetables at farmers markets, built relationships with restaurants interested in local produce. The property became productive in ways her grandfather would have appreciated, Not just preserved, but working. Caleb officially reduced his city workload, taking only restoration projects that interested him, spending more time at the mountain. He and Elena navigated the complications of blending lives, where to keep clothes, how to coordinate schedules, which holidays went where. It wasn't always smooth, but they approached difficulties the same way they'd approached the barn, with honesty, patience, and commitment to building something that would last. Mia flourished in the new arrangement. She'd found purpose in the workshops, discovered she had talent for teaching younger students, developed confidence that came from mastering difficult skills. Her relationship with Caleb deepened as they worked side by side, the physical labor creating space for conversations that had been impossible when emotion was the only bridge between them. One evening in August, working late to finish a project before sunset, Mia asked the question Caleb had been expecting. "Are you going to marry Elena?" He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I'd like to. Eventually. When we're both ready." "When will that be?" "I don't know. We're still figuring out logistics, making sure this works long term. Marriage is a big commitment." Mia set down the board she'd been sanding. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're both scared it'll fall apart like your first marriages did. So you're going extra slow, being extra careful, making sure there's no risk." Caleb recognized his own caution reflected back at him through his daughter's observation. "That's probably true. But the barn almost fell apart too, and you saved it by taking risks, working faster than you thought possible, trusting people you barely knew, betting everything on meeting an impossible deadline." She looked at him directly. "Sometimes the careful choice is just another way of being afraid." "When did you get so wise?" "I've been paying attention. You taught me that building things right takes courage, not just skill. Maybe relationships are the same." That night, lying beside Elena in the cabin, Caleb thought about what Mia had said, about courage and caution, about the difference between wisdom and fear. He'd spent 3 years protecting himself through careful emotional management, and it had left him isolated and lonely. "Elena?" he said into the darkness. "Hmm?" "Mia asked if I was going to marry you." He felt Elena's attention sharpen. "What did you tell her?" "That I wanted to. Eventually. When we were ready." "And what does ready look like?" Caleb thought about that, about the barn they'd saved, the workshops they'd built, the life they were creating together through small, daily choices. "I think we're already there. I think we've been ready since we decided this was real." Elena rolled to face him. "Are you asking me something?" "Not yet. Not officially. But I'm saying I want to. That I'm done being careful, if careful just means delaying what we both already know." "What do we already know?" "That this works, that we're better together than apart, that our daughters are thriving with both of us around, that the life we're building matters in ways neither of us could have built alone." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "My husband proposed in a barn. It would be fitting if you did too." "Is that a hint?" "It's a suggestion for when you're ready to make it official." Caleb kissed her, feeling gratitude and hope and the particular rightness that came from choosing vulnerability over protection. "Soon," he promised. September arrived with the kind of weather mountains specialized in: warm days, cold nights, leaves beginning their slow turn toward gold. The workshop schedule was full through October, and they'd started getting inquiries about winter sessions on furniture making and finish carpentry. Caleb planned the proposal for the last weekend of September, during a workshop break when the barn would be empty. He asked Mia's permission first, which made his daughter cry happy tears, and immediately start planning with Sophie. "Nothing elaborate," he told them, "just simple and true." Saturday evening, he asked Elena to walk to the barn with him. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in colors that seemed impossible: deep orange, brilliant pink, purple shadows in the valleys. The barn stood solid against that light, every board and beam evidence of what they'd fought to save. "You know what I realized?" Caleb said as they stood in the barn's center. "This place changed my life. Not just because I met you here, but because it reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible." "The barn or us?" Elena asked. "Both. The barn taught me that quality matters more than convenience. You taught me that connection matters more than protection." He took her hand, felt her fingers intertwine with his. 4 months ago, you asked if I was married. I said no, and that answer opened a door I'd been keeping closed for 3 years. Now I'm asking you a different question. Elena's eyes widened slightly as Caleb pulled a ring from his pocket. Nothing elaborate, just a simple band with a small stone that caught the fading light. Will you marry me? He asked. Not because it's the logical next step or because our daughters expect it, but because I want to build the rest of my life with you the same way we built this barn, with patience, honesty, and commitment to creating something that lasts. Elena's answer came through tears and laughter and a kiss that felt like coming home. Yes, absolutely yes. They stood holding each other as the last light faded, the barn solid around them, the mountains eternal beyond. Caleb thought about all the moments that had led here. His initial refusal, Elena's persistence, the first day of demolition, the impossible deadline, the inspector's approval. Every choice, every risk, every moment of choosing connection over safety had built toward this. Not just the proposal, but the life they'd created together, a life built right, meant to last, like the barn itself. The wedding happened in November, small and simple in the barn they'd saved. Marcus served as Caleb's best man, Sophie as Elena's maid of honor. Mia stood between them during the ceremony, a visible symbol of the family they were choosing to become. Inspector Garfield attended with his wife, along with Patricia and her family, workshop students who'd become friends, neighbors from the valley who'd watched Elena fight for her land. The barn was decorated with late-season flowers from Elena's garden, lit by lanterns that cast warm light across the timber frame. The ceremony itself was brief, vows they'd written themselves, promises about building together, creating space for growth, choosing partnership over isolation. When they kissed, the gathered people cheered, and Caleb felt certainty settle into his bones. This was right. This was true. The reception lasted into evening, music and food and celebration that felt like community rather than performance. Mia danced with Sophie, both girls laughing about something private and happy. Marcus gave a toast about quality workmanship in both carpentry and marriage. Elena's elderly neighbor spoke about her grandfather, about the barn's history, about how fitting it was that new life was beginning in a place that honored the past. Late in the evening, when things were winding down, Caleb found himself back at the main support beam where this had all started. Elena joined him, her wedding dress simple and practical, her hand warm in his. "My father would have loved this," she said. "Not just the wedding, but everything, the workshops, the garden, the way we're using his land for something that matters." "What about your husband? What would he think?" Elena considered that. "I think he'd be happy I found someone who understands that love isn't about replacing what came before. It's about building something new while honoring what you learned from the past." "That's beautiful. That's you. You never asked me to forget my history, just to let you be part of my future." They stood together watching their community celebrate, people brought together by a barn, by shared work, by the belief that quality and craftsmanship and connection still mattered in a world that often valued none of those things. Caleb thought about the question Elena had asked that first day, the question that had changed everything. "Are you married?" The answer had been no, not just factually, but emotionally, spiritually, in every way that mattered. He'd been closed off, protected, convinced that isolation was wisdom. Now, standing in a barn they'd saved together, married to a woman who'd taught him that asking for help was courage, surrounded by a daughter who was thriving, and a community that had formed around shared values, the answer was different. He was married, fully, completely, in ways that transcended legal documents or ceremonies. He was built into partnership, woven into family, committed to creating something that would last long after the barn itself crumbled. The structure they'd fought to save would stand for decades, maybe centuries if maintained properly. But the real construction, the relationships they'd built, the community they'd formed, the life they'd chosen together, that would last in ways no building could. Because they'd built it right, built it honest, built it to last. And that, Caleb realized with quiet certainty, was the only kind of construction that truly mattered. The barn stood behind them in the November darkness, solid and true, while inside, people laughed and danced and celebrated the joining of two lives that had almost remained separate. The mountains watched, indifferent and eternal, as they always had. But the barn? The barn remembered. It held in its timber frame the story of impossible deadlines and second chances, of carpentry as metaphor and love as construction project, of a question asked at exactly the right moment by someone brave enough to risk the answer. The barn that wouldn't fall had become the foundation for everything that followed. And standing there with Elena's hand in his, Caleb understood that some structures, the best structures, were built not just with wood and nails and craftsmanship, but with courage, connection, and the willingness to say yes when every rational reason said no. They'd built something that would last, together. And that was enough. That was everything.